So one of the things that's really amazing about Commons is this just incredibly brilliant group of people that I get to work with and learn from. And I was watching Scott's sermon from Sunday in Inglewood, and one of the ideas he brought out in Romans 11 has really been fascinating me. There's this famous metaphor that Paul uses where he talks about the idea of a wild shoot being grafted on to a cultivated olive plant. It's this idea that those of us who are non-Jews, who are Gentile, get to benefit from this story that has been cultivated and shaped for generations all through the Hebrew Scriptures, and now we get the privilege of being grafted into that story. Really beautiful metaphor, really beautiful image of what we now get to participate in. But the thing is, if you know anything about how the world works, this is exactly the opposite of what happens in real life. In the cultivation of olives, you never take a wild shoot and graft that onto a cultivated plant. Wild olive trees actually don't produce fruit or olives that you can eat. In fact, that actually takes generations of cultivating the plant to get something useful out of it. And so what you actually did was the opposite. You took shoots from cultivated plants and you grafted them onto wild olive trees, thereby taking advantage of their more robust natural root system, but skipping ahead to the cultivated fruit that you ultimately want to get out of them. And I love this because it's the same thing Paul does a number of times in Romans, where he's talking at two levels here. At one level, there's this really beautiful, accessible metaphor of the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, benefiting from a story that's not theirs. We get grafted in, and all of that shaping and cultivating, that planning God has done now becomes ours. Amazing. But at a second level, Paul is doing something really neat here, and he's undermining our assumptions about the world. He's telling us that our whole concept of who's on the inside, who's on the outside, who God has been working with, and who God hasn't been working with actually don't line up with what we see when we see the full picture of God in the story of Jesus. That here, our categories of who's wild and left alone and who's cultivated and cared for in the past, these are false categories. That God has always been at work in all people, shaping and bringing that story to the culmination in Christ. And now, once we get exposed to it, we get invited in, we look back and we see the ways that God has been present everywhere at all times, bringing all peoples into God's embrace. And this is really what Paul's point is all through the book of Romans, that God is so much bigger than we imagine, that God has been at work in so many different stories than we think, and that in the end, when we actually see the grace and the expanse and the inclusion of God, it is going to take our breath away. And so in whatever ways you have been conditioned to see the world as insiders and outsiders and cultivated stories and wild stories running amok, know that God is present in all of them somewhere, somehow, even if you don't see it right now. And one day, when we're all grafted together into one family in the embrace of God, we are going to see the incredible ways that Jesus has been present all through all of our histories, inviting us home.